Good evening, David.
That's the way. And look, our special guest for this evening at late notice, and we're very appreciative of Peter to find the time out of his evening at such late notice. But our special guest is Peter Senior, a local resident of the Cairns area and a consultant and a UK resident and born UK citizen and educated at Cambridge, but has made his way over to the Pacific area and lived in New Zealand as well as Cairns and has finally settled in Cairns. Peter, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, look, Peter, would you like to tell some of our listeners just a little bit about yourself and sort of your career as it spans through your being born in the UK and travelling to places like the New Zealand and now Australia, and just a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so that's my pleasure, David. Well, as you mentioned, my start of my academic career was getting a degree in engineering at the London University. Then I went to Cambridge University and studied management for a while before joining IBM as a system engineer. And after about 3 years there, Britain was going downhill so fast, I figured I'd better go to some other country and went to New Zealand and joined New Zealand newspapers as a methods engineer. And after a few years, I ended up as general manager of the largest newspaper, the Auckland Star, the second largest broadsheet in New Zealand, which worked very well for a while until Brierley Investments bought them out, and took exactly 2 years to ruin the largest publishing company in New Zealand, which time I was the first executive to be booted out, thank goodness, and I became a management consultant with Deloitte. The timing was exquisite because it was just around the time that the Longy government had taken over, and David Longy and his two sidekicks were unutterably brilliant, and they set about changing the whole government and government's approach, and I was very involved in restructuring quite a few government departments and quite a few corporations, which worked actually brilliantly until some of you may know that David Longy unfortunately got shacked up for 2 weeks with a lady in Wellington who switched him back to his socialist past. And he fell out badly with 2 cohorts. But the restructuring carried on, and I learned a phenomenal amount about governance, governing, restructuring, and more about management. And that formed the basis for, I'll just leap on very briefly, after I came to New Zealand, having decided that it was too damn cold in Auckland, and surely we could find somewhere more pleasant, and we figured Cairns was the place. And we've never had a different opinion since. I did quite a few consulting assignments. Some of them were with Cairns Water, and I learned a lot from this. And I guess the last one, after about 3 months facilitating the $200 million project, I wrote a letter to the general manager and said, I'm sorry, I'm resigning. Unfortunately, I found your management too bad at this organisation, and as far as the project goes, the ethics are unacceptable. At that stage, I decided I would write a book about governance in Australia, and I decided to completely redesign the Australian government. For some strange reason, this wasn't taken up when I sent it to a lot of politicians. But about the same stage, Warren introduced me to the subject of the Cairns Trinity inlet dredging. And this, of course, Andrew, I guess is Andrew Cummings is no doubt listening again, and Andrew, Bill and Emma were highly involved, and that was very educational. I found out how appalling administration is, and how it didn't actually matter what facts and figures and evidence and cost-benefit analysis were done. The bureaucrats were going to want to do what they wanted to do anyway. It was very, very educational, and that probably covers the main points, probably in more detail than you really needed.
No, look, it was all wonderful, Peter, because obviously for those of the residents that might listen outside of the Cairns area and don't see your constant, editorials and stuff in the Cairns Post, as well as your active involvement in all of the smaller organisations around this area, it's great for them to have a premise of just who you are and what led you to end up here, just like a lot of people have that aren't necessarily born from the region, to settle in this beautiful part of the world. And look, thank you for that background story. But I must admit, even as you mentioned there at when the Longy government, obviously he had a 2-week period where it switched him back over to socialists. They've well and truly gone down that road a little bit further these days, haven't they?
Well, they were going in the right direction and gradually they sunk back, but now with the well-known communist Lucinda Ardern, they're heading very much in the wrong direction.
Well, I guess it's their country and they'll do it with their will, but no wonder so many of them end up over here, like you
Indeed.
Yes, I don't think it's just because of the closities of their two nations. I think a lot of them probably get a little bit sick of it and go, at least I can go over the ditch.
Yes.
Yes, but look, well, Peter, we might as well have a brief discussion about the fact of your involvement in governance and structures of governance. Now, New Zealand's a great example of a small Western-based country that does not necessarily have a structure like Australia and most other Western nations like America and the like, with states. They seem to just govern themselves in a more streamlined manner because of the size of themselves. And could you tell us a little about your involvement on when you had a consultancy firm helping them structure?
Yes. The fundamental difference between New Zealand and Australia as far as governance goes is, of course, they don't have states. They have 2 levels of government, the central in Canberra and the locals. Now, that used to work quite well, but it's been gradually going downhill as the government has gone more and more towards so-called diversity and has been bringing more and more rules in which give the Maoris far, far more control. And what they call the country now first Aotearoa, which is, of course, the Maori name for New Zealand, and that's put forward ahead of New Zealand. There's many other items of legislation which make it very, very difficult to get anything done. And with the Labour government and under Ardern, they've, of course, stopped anything to do with oil and gas drilling. They're putting more and more impositions on the farmers. Their approach to so-called greenery and carbon dioxide is getting quite excessive. So they were very, very fortunate to have a large amount of energy, and I led the restructuring of what was the original the government electricity New Zealand Electricity Division to turn it into a state-owned enterprise, which was called Electricorp, and I led the restructuring twice. And as an example of the sort of changes, when we started examining the strategy, we found they were focused almost entirely on designing and building new generation projects, dams, power stations, and the like. When we examined the whole strategy, we found if we introduced, for instance, the time of day tariff, they wouldn't need another power station for another 12 years. And so nearly all the engineers were removed and they were replaced by operational engineers to work on the efficiency. There are many, many examples like this. And I mean, another good one was Forestry Corporation, where the government owned nearly all the forests, or about 70% of the forests. And we restructured that, and over 90% of the staff were made redundant, but the great majority of those were offered a lot of financial assistance to set up their own companies and to contract back to the new state-owned enterprise. And after about a couple of years, the great majority were actually thrilled with it and earning about 3 times as much as they had as public servants. And those are just a couple of examples. Telecom is another one that we restructured, which sort of gradually turned it from being a hopeless monopoly to a very competitive organisation offering high-quality services, which wasn't easy at all. The same was happening in quite a few private corporations. And for instance, I led the restructuring of a couple of port harbour boards, Christchurch and Littleton, where we separated out the legal requirements from the commercial requirements, so the commercial requirements could operate again as a normal limited liability company, and thus the result was their efficiency was massively improved. I could go on for about a couple of hours, but I think you've probably got the gist.
Well, look, Peter, I think you've started to dangle the fruit in front of our listeners about the efficiencies that government could attain, but I don't think anybody's going to be used to it. And look, I'm sure at some point people understand that when you have bloated organisations that are funded essentially by the taxpayer and provide some form of revenue back to the government, and Queensland is a great example of that, I think we can find that the inefficiencies are part of the problem, especially in a place like Queensland. Would you agree?
Yes, I would, but there's one very, very fundamental point which is invariably missed, and it's really incentives. One thing we found with virtually all civil servants in New Zealand was that they went to work each day and sat in front of their desk to follow a process. Now, the fundamental change we made with them was, you're not there to follow a process. We don't give a damn about the process. We want results. And so they had goals and plans and incentive to achieve results. And we weren't overly fussed about the process they followed, how they did it, although, of course, there were various protocols. Once about 90% of the people loved this, about 10% couldn't stand it, and they left, which was all for the good. So once they got the hang of the fact that their job was to deliver results, performance results, and had targets, it made all the difference.
Well, I guess people in any given role need to be hungry to achieve something in it, and if they don't, it becomes stagnant and they'll only, I guess, not necessarily like their situations.
True indeed.
I think I remember reading something upon the lines where it's irrespective of how much you're getting paid and in what industry or role that you're in as well. That is across the board, and I guess it's the human condition, isn't it?
Yes, it's the human condition. I think the great majority, given the opportunity to achieve a specific result that they believe in, then once they achieve it, even during the process of achieving it, it gives them great satisfaction. But going in and following the process, say, after I've done A, I do B, and after I've done B, I do C. When I've done C, I go back and do A again. It's not terribly satisfying. And so, they're looking for something that will be more satisfactory. And unfortunately, what happens, of course, as you probably know better than me, that if you're running a department, invariably a government department, you're paid according to your budget. And your budget depends on a number of staff. So, in order to increase your pay, you need to increase your budget. And to do that, you've got increase staff, and you do that by creating more and more regulations, and then modifying the regulations, and then checking that the regulations are being fulfilled, and then finding there's problems and making more regulations. It's a never-ending circle. In fact, if you keep going, it's not that long before every single person in the country becomes a civil servant, in theory.
Well, we can attest to the fact that Queensland is well and truly on that path, I think, Peter, because we have the largest and most public service in the whole of the nation, from what I understand. And look, I'm fairly certain that is the case. But I mean, I guess this leads us down a path where I'd love. Look, Peter, I think we could. I'd love to touch on some COVID-19 stuff soon, and how you think the government, how you think the government has responded in what fashion, whether it's good or bad, or some good and some bad. And I'd love to hear your caveats as opposed to that. But I guess the first thing I want to ask, just leading off what we've just discussed, is what's your thoughts on a state that's structured like the existing Queensland? And obviously the theme of tonight's show, as they always have been, is about the possibilities of creating a new state for Central and North Queensland. But the structure of that is something that's not worth discussing at this point. It's something that we should aspire to necessarily for the benefit of all of the communities in Central and North Queensland. But let's talk about the existing state. What are your thoughts on a state that doesn't have an upper house, the size of Queensland, with the population that it's concentrated in the southeast corner, with control of organisations and corporations which are essentially arms of the government, like Ergon and like the port authorities up and down the coast? Because these sort of organisations are riddled with exactly what you're talking about. Would you say that that's the case?
Yes, I would. I do have a confession first, though. The book I wrote on redesigning the Australian government had two levels of government. There will be no states, no territories, on the basis that the states predominantly duplicate what is done in both the central and local. Now, the biggest lesson that I learnt from restructuring government departments and corporations in New Zealand was that once you've got to understand how it all works, what they're doing and so on, you don't move into solution mode. What you do is you stand back and say, basically, if nothing existed, what would I do to redesign or design an organisation suited for now and the future? And the chances that you come up with anything remotely like what's happening at the moment are almost zero. Now I move on and say that was certainly the substance of the book I wrote. However, as I said earlier, for some unaccountable reasons, all the politicians I sent my book to either didn't respond or sent some rather negative feedback. To no surprise whatsoever. No surprise. So, and this is an important bit. I recognise that was an ideal, and it's very, very rare, unfortunately, that ideals are achieved anywhere. And the only way it would actually be achieved if we had a Lee Kuan Yew clone who became suddenly, by some magic reason, a benevolent dictator in Australia, who did say this whole load of governance at the moment is a heap of fetid dingoes' kidneys, if you read your Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the only way is to start from scratch. Now, that's not going to happen. There's a zillion people, every bureaucrat, every politician is going to protect their territory. So I come back, a very, very good second best, I think, would be to have a North Queensland state and have it set up with a governance structure that was along the lines of best management practice. And there's a lot of it, and very, very little of it is applied to governments. And for instance, when you mention, for instance, Ergon and so on, I maintain that a proper governance structure would have no assets except for one or two where it's necessary, such as parkland. But as for instance, electricity, there's no earthly reason why the government should own any electricity assets. Sure, there is a need that for high voltage transmission. That's a natural monopoly, and it's necessary for monopoly regulations to apply by the government. But I can't think offhand of any other asset that a state government needs to own that it can't handle better by setting up the proper governance mechanisms for them.
Well, and the right competition for those industries.
Or private industry.
Yeah, private industry and competition, because that's definitely one thing that we lack, especially when we can discuss energy in Central and North Queensland. We go begging and pleading for the one supplier.
Well, absolutely true, but I think that was really extension of what I was getting at, that where there is only one supplier, then that's a monopoly and it's got to be bound by monopolistic regulations. But once the disincentives that exist for competitors to set up, which are colossal at the moment, once they're removed, then competition arises naturally. I mean, the whole situation as far as wind farms and solar is an absolute disgrace. All that money that's being paid out in subsidies is appalling. If all those regulations were removed, I have no doubt that large amounts of competitive industries for generation in particular would arise, because they would be profitable. But at the moment it can't possibly happen, because all the potential competitors know that they're going to be hamstrung by regulations, and even if they can find a way through them, some new regulations is going to be produced which is going to kill them off anyway.
Well, and that's so true, because that's, and I'll say one thing before I pass on to Bill, because I'm sure he has a couple of things he'd love to mention, but that's the silly component about the argument that lots of people use about the coal-fired power stations and traditional methods of energy generation are going the wayside because there's no investment. And you have this conversation with people, it's like, why would you invest your money in an industry which makes sense on paper, but the government is involved and therefore hindering that industry or subsidising another component that also does energy generation? And I guess that is the fundamental issue with government being involved in the first place when it comes to that. If it was private enterprise buying for customers in a traditional fashion that was regulated in whatever, ecological sense you want about carbon emissions, or even if that was implemented, if the industry was free to be competitive, it would be. I think Alan Jones uses the best example. If you were a baker and you were baking bread, but the government was giving another baker down the road money to bake his bread, of course your bread's not going to be bought. And I think that's the silliest situation you could be found in, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of Alan Jones. I can't remember the last thing he said which I disagreed with.
Well, when you make sense, you make sense, and it was bloody lovely to see him commentating on the state elections that we've just had. So, Bill, did you have a couple of things you'd like to comment on everything that Peter's said so far?
Yeah, just before we go too far forward, just rewind in regards to the situation with Peter's book, and then trying to introduce that sort of system into a country like Australia, which is vastly different from New Zealand, and our history. And regardless of what individual ideas we might want, we were founded by 6 individual colonies that, had they waited a little bit longer and avoided federation, they would have been 6 sovereign countries. Now, not that necessarily would have been a good idea, but the idea of getting rid of states, and it's been voiced around. I mean, Bob Hawke mouthed it off, and Peter Beattie mouthed it off, and other people mouth it off, and as though our constitution and our history doesn't exist, which is a bit of a worry. But the other thing is, in Australia, there is only 2 levels of government, and regardless, and that's a fact, regardless of though people keep going on about local government. Local governments are merely the administrative arms of the state governments. At a stroke of the pen, all of those local councils can be eradicated or put into administration or under administrators. They're probably the biggest curse we've had. Well, yeah, but they're the biggest curse in regards to, they're the things that have grown so much. We now have 535 councils, and if you look at some of the major ones, their CEOs and CFOs are getting more than premiers and prime ministers. And the cost that they've laid onto the people in the last 20 years since they've gone from councils with their honorariums and shire clerks to politicians, as they are consider themselves, and their remuneration and the remuneration of the CEOs and the CFOs it's just horrific, you know. And really, I think we'd be much better off if it was pushed back and people understood that there are only administrative arms of the state government, and they need to not to get involved in a lot of things they do get involved in. So I think that's one of the points. And like I say, there's no way we're going to, like a state like West Australia or Queensland or any of the other states, even Tasmania, they're not going to accept being demolished and just be a handful of local government or councils. So I think that's the other problem. And of course we've had attempts of amalgamating councils, and we know how well that works. So having people might say, well, get rid of state governments, have just the federal government, and if the people in Canberra are that far out of touch with ordinary people, that's a bit of a worry. But I would have difficulty in regards to, I don't think councils are very good at amalgamating. And the other thing is, even if we reduce our 535 councils down to 300 or 400, I can't imagine a council in regional Queensland making its way down to Canberra and get a reasonable handout compared to the council that goes down from Sydney and puts their hand out. So I think we just got to deal with what we've got and just use the Constitution we've got to go forward.
Yeah, I think a lot of good points there, Bill. You're being very pragmatic. Again, coming back to my experience restructuring in New Zealand, one of the things that we found is the worst possible thing to do is when something's broken, keep tweaking with bits and pieces and think it'll get better. It won't. It'll get worse. But we were extremely fortunate that we had a situation and directive and direction from the highest level that they wanted to see dramatic changes. And so we had full support from the chairs of the new establishment boards, who gave us free rein to come up with something totally different. And we did, and they were massively successful, mostly until they started falling apart. As far as Australia is concerned, I think in an ideal world, there will be a minimalist central government looking after the basic things that have to be done centrally, like defence, foreign affairs, taxation system, and, just an aside, my perfect system would remove every single tax there is and just replace it all with just one very, very simple single tax. That's a separate issue. But going back to your points about, Bill, about local governments, yes, they're a mess. I'm not sure they're any greater mess than the States or Canberra is at the moment. And yes, they are pretty well subservient to the state. In an ideal world, and if there were no states and territories, then the local government would have considerably more accountability and would, I think, be responsible for basically local services that couldn't practically be provided on a competitive basis, such as most education and hospitals, mostly. But this is the ideal world again, and unfortunately, I can't see any solution, but really the one that you've been coming up with, Bill, anyway. We just say, hey, we're just not going to get to this ideal world. There's too many factors against us, too many opponents, too strong of opponents. So let's make the best of what we could do, which would be set up a North Queensland state and with a new set of governance, rules, principles, approaches, etc. And who knows, maybe you'll be able to set up a new relationship for the governance, for the local councils too.
I think
We
that's
can
the
always
most
hope.
interesting. Yeah, well, that's the most interesting component, Peter, that some of us get excited about the fact that we live in an amazing technological age at the moment. And wouldn't it be nice to basically start a state of our own from scratch, where we can actually implement technological advances that have happened in the last, say, 2 decades, that would actually streamline the process of governance occurring at a more reasonable fashion, which is better and easier with the minimal amount of burden upon the taxpayer. It could be exciting what could become up, because the decentralization of the departments, knowing that they could fully contact each other in a 21st century communication way, it's not really, in my mind, it's not taken on board as much as it could be in the current context. I think we're still drudging along to the 20th century way that governance has occurred, and Queensland suffers the most due to the fact that we only have the one House of Parliament. But could you see extreme benefits in streamlining governments if a new state was to occur in Central Queensland that would just extremely change the landscape in which people consider being governed?
Oh, massively, massively. I think the question would be how and is, rather than would be, how to win the hearts and minds of the general public to accept that there is an alternative, it would be a better alternative, and more than anything else, it would be advantageous for them. It would be good for them in the hip pocket. Now, I think it will be extremely difficult to do and take a lot of cunning and PR. But I think until the general public think basically A, there's an alternative, a real alternative, B, it will be better for them, and C, there is a way of getting there if they support it.
Well, that's the point. And look, Australian politics is a strange one to all of us these days, because it seems that we're walking around in a daze when it comes to most parts. Because I can tell you from my experience talking to my friends and my family and just work colleagues and general people that I deal with through work, it seems to be that people are making the choice of the lesser of two evils. And I think it's become a little bit too much of a norm when it comes to politics these days. But Central and North Queenslanders are resilient. We want simple things done by a simplistic government that just gets out of the way and lets us basically have a free enterprise environment that we could just prosper and take care of ourselves. But with the burden of the southeast corner, where I must add that that's where the predominant employment of the public service is, we are left with situations which is what we'll lead into, COVID-19. Now, Peter, we'd love to know...
Ah, yes. Now, funny you should say that, because I think that is where the greatest opportunity lies.
What's happened to you, David? David, we can't hear you.
Are you there?
We are faded.
Are you there?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, I was just about to say that, what are your thoughts, Peter, on the fact that when COVID first struck, and Anastasia Palaszczuk was the humming and the hawing on the TV and saying, we're going to protect all of Queensland and Queenslanders will be safe and the borders were going to be shut, the borders were going to be closed. But what are your thoughts upon the height and when the restrictions first implemented, that the small pub in Richmond or Charters Towers or any of the local smaller communities in inland Queensland or any part of remote central and north Queensland couldn't go to the pub and have a beer with a zilch amount of cases of COVID in any amount of distance around them? What is your thoughts on the one-size-fits-all sort of scenario we got stuck with?
I think one of the big problems is can't see the wood for the trees. It's getting into the minutiae of the program. The last letter I wrote to the Cairns Post, which did not get published, said that as we approach Christmas, there's going to be 2 sets of books and articles coming out. There's going to be one set which is basically for or by governments, which are going to be telling us what a truly splendid job they made, how all the things they did was absolutely correct, and they've saved us from a fateful death. Now, the second set is going to be the polar opposite. It's going to explain that nearly everything that the governments did, and this is for most governments around the world, a few I think got it right, like Taiwan, But most governments in the world, I think, got almost everything wrong. And I think the opportunity is there's now so much information which is proving this latter point. I'll just flip through a few of them that I think carefully explained and providing the evidence could actually get the message across to the general public that they've had the biggest con there's ever been in history. Actually, just as a side, I published a book 3 years ago that was called "You've Been Conned," and I go over that most of the things that we're taught and learn and expect and assume in life, when you dig deep, are actually basically wrong. Anyway, coming back to COVID, it seems to me the basic points, getting away from the minutiae, are first of all, the COVID-19 has not been defined. No expert has actually defined what it is. But then the measures applied to it as to whether you've got it or not is using the PCR test, which was developed by a Nobel-winning scientist who strongly advised it should never ever be used outside specialist laboratories because it produces large numbers of false negatives, false positives. It's applied in quite the wrong way. I could talk for a couple of hours on this, but this is the key point. Nearly all the actions taken by government have been based on the number of quote-unquote cases. And these cases have been produced by a measure which is highly inaccurate and manipulated in any case. And then moving on from that, what is actually done in terms of lockdowns, isolation, distancing, and so on, not a single one of these has got a valid scientific basis for it. In fact, there's an increasing number of books, articles, you name it, which demonstrate that every single one of them is mostly fundamentally wrong. I say mostly in as much as some of them, like for instance wearing of masks, there's a few limited occasions it can be useful and effective, but the great majority of times it's highly ineffective. The little things that carry the viruses actually go through the holes in the masks. People have the masks in the handbag or pocket or whatever, they get all dirty, and they produce huge negative side effects such as all sorts of psychological problems. And then the number of people, because of isolation and lockdowns, who've committed suicide in the last few months is colossal. And basically, I think and distancing is a similar thing. Apparently these little bug things can actually travel for 30 metres, not just for 1.5 metres, for goodness sake. And I think the one measure which increasingly is available for a lot of countries is what they call the excess deaths, over and above what was last year, the year before, and so on. And in some countries, and Britain is one of them, if you look at the numbers of so-called COVID cases compared with flu cases, the flu cases go on fairly steadily to March, and suddenly in March they drop down to almost zero, and the COVID-19 cases take off. Now, you'd have to be an absolute idiot not to think, so COVID-19 has now taken over what was flu. So, in summary, I guess what I'm saying is that there seems to be ample material evidence, genuine scientific evidence to demonstrate if you can actually get past the highly dodgy mainstream media, that to convince people that they've been conned, and that a new approach by a new government could actually switch it right around to policies, practice, actions which are based on genuine, proved science. Here endeth the lesson.
Yeah, well, that's the point, isn't it, Peter? I mean, we could, and the media definitely has a part to play the world around in this current scenario we all face ourselves. But I mean, the fact that some cases now are being inflated in particular areas, and I've heard many accounts in the States where this is happening, where the death rate and the infection rate is being inflated to some degree because of malmanagement of the fact that it's like, hang on, is this a flu or is this the COVID? Because you can't have both being tallied up towards the fact that, oh, there's another 5,000 cases when 1,500 of them might actually just be the common flu. And like you say, it seems to me that they've just...
Well, David, I think so. Yeah, so there's a very important point, and that's incentives. I mean, you would no doubt know that in the United States, if a doctor or hospital puts down someone who's died or is in hospital as from COVID-19, they get about 20 times the payment from the government. So what are you going to do? And what happens in practice if there's any sort of infection or that looks a little bit like something from the chest, it's put down as COVID-19. There's been lots of examples where men have actually died from a motorcycle accident, and that's COVID-19.
I could just see a nurse looking to a doctor,
but no,
to a nurse and going, yes, COVID, yes, nurse, yes, doctor, no, COVID, yes.
yes. But I think and governments have got so into groupthink now that they feel compelled to go down the official route for this is COVID-19, this is what we must do, this has been the right thing, we've saved your lives. It'll be a very, very brave politician, and I think this is going to have to happen soon, who says, geez, we actually got it wrong. Because they sure as hell did. And they've ruined our economy on several points which are fundamentally flawed.
Well, let's take that and go back to the original premise, Peter. And sorry, Bill obviously has something to say, but what about localised economies? What about economies like North Queensland and Central Queensland that are essentially isolated from the southeast corner where the largest outbreaks in our existing state were? What are your thoughts on the fact that we should have to have similar lockdown repercussions when a small outbreak might occur in somewhere like the CBD of Brisbane? I mean, surely at least we can all agree that we suffered more than we needed to in the central and northern regions under the premise that there was a threat which was predominantly in the southeast corner. I constantly rack my head about the local economies being put at risk in our local communities on the premise that there was probably 5 cases at one point, and they were probably all isolating in a hotel room because they came from an international flight. And it's one of the, like you said, it's probably the best example we could use right now of why we should have autonomy and self-governance in our central and northern regions.
Absolutely. I mean, it'd be fascinating to actually, you could probably find the real figures as far as people got flu, plot the line for people who got flu, how many people got something which is mythically called COVID-19, and in all probability demonstrate it never existed in the first place, the number of excess deaths, the real figures and facts, then go through demonstrating that nearly everything that the Palaszczuk government did can be proved completely false, but I guess the difficulty was a far north state would still not be able to, under that scenario, open up its borders to the other states, but it sure as hell could open up its borders to every other country that wanted to come in.
Well, exactly, and that is the point.
They might well find that once the fact...
Yeah. Sorry, continue.
Oh, well, no, once the facts are out, you might well find that there's riots in other states and the Northern Territory that say, hell, these North Queenslanders, they've explained what's really happening. We're being conned, you buggers in government. Riots on the street, or threat riots on the street, and as soon as mass action is threatened or actually starts happening, then politicians have this interesting approach which they changed their mind.
Well, and that's
You remember, who was it said...
Sorry, Peter, go.
I don't remember. Just remember who was it said that when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Trying to remember who that's a quote from. It'll come back.
But that's the point. It was we were strategically positioned to actually really do well out of the fact that we were our area, because as it became more and more apparent about the information regarding COVID, well and truly after the knee-jerk reactions that every government had worldwide, including Queensland, once it started being released that it hates warmth, it can't last in the sunlight, and all of these things that North Queensland and Central Queensland are abundant in, it makes you think, well, that's probably why there's not a lot of cases, A. And B, geez, wouldn't it be great if we could just say, hey, like, you know, we're still open for business. Anyone domestically, if you want to travel, that's great. Come and visit us because everything's fine up here, hunky-dory. Obviously, we have the restrictions when it comes to international travel, but with domestic travel now being back in vogue, so to speak, due to all of these restrictions worldwide, we are positioned. We should be positioned a lot better than we are now to take advantage of that. The domestic tourism is going to flock to Central and North Queensland based on this premise. That is, of course, if we don't keep getting locked borders and the like from the southeast corner. But I think ultimately this is going to have repercussions for years and years and resonate in people's minds for a long time to come.
Yes, it's going to depend, I think, what happens in the next few months or year or so, because it's abundantly clear. I'm very sorry to say, having examined dozens and dozens and dozens of so-called conspiracy theories, it's abundantly clear that the so-called COVID-19 has been planned for quite a few years. It's no great surprise, and is actually a major part of the step towards the so-called Great Reset, which Davos and their mates are actually trying to push upon us at the moment. And it's in their interest to create another so-called resurgence. And the almost funny thing is, it used to be funny if it wasn't so sick, in the Northern Hemisphere, every year as winter comes, flu arrives. Always the same. It's just a question of how many, how bad. And so the so-called resurgence of COVID-19 is, of course, the normal annual flu. And so, of course, there's going to be a so-called resurgence.
Yes, well, the weather brings it upon us, they have no choice. Yes, of course, Bill. I was about to say, Bill, it's about your time to have a thought.
Just in regards to the difference between COVID and flu, they are different viruses. The first instance of COVID family is our common cold, which we've never had any success in curing anyway. But there again, who would want to cure it when every year you can count on billions and billions of dollars in sale in cold and flu tablets? But the other thing is, the first serious COVID we had was SARS-02, which was in 2002, that came again out of China and again linked to bats. That outbreak, it was, I think there was a lot of drama in the newspapers and that over it, but overall, it only claimed about 800 odd lives. 500 of those were in China, and it only migrated to 28 countries worldwide. So it was fairly contained, and it also dissipated fairly quickly naturally, although there was no cure or no vaccine for it. And the other thing is, we've had nearly 17 years of research, and they've never found a vaccine for COVID-02. The last pandemic we had, and a lot of people seem to think what we're having now, this COVID pandemic, is something new. But I mean, anyone does a bit of basic research. We had, if you can go right back to the most serious one, the Spanish flu. But in late 50s, we had the Asian flu. In the early 60s, we had the Hong Kong flu, which claimed over 1 million people each. And the thing with flu, it's less discriminatory. It takes out children, pregnant women, young, fit, old, infirmed, right across the board. But again, mainly the elder and people with pre-existing conditions. The last pandemic, and this was only a short while ago, it's amazing how people's short memory they got, because 2009 was the last pandemic we had, and that was the swine flu. Now, swine flu was just ordinary influenza A, H1N1, with its annual variety change, and it was actually linked to pig farming was the mutation. And the first death was in Mexico, and they originally going to call it the Mexican flu. But they didn't think that was a good idea, and they kept the name swine flu. Now, swine flu, because it happened in the northern hemisphere, and it was only H1A and H1N1, influenza A, it was treatable by the normal vaccine. But in the first instance, it's had rapid outbreaks in the northern hemisphere before the vaccines came into effect. But the only reason that was put it down as a pandemic, or the WHO introduced a pandemic notice against it, because the rapid rate of onset between getting seriously ill and death. In other words, what happened is the first time people got noticeably sick from it to when they were basically in need of strong medical intervention in ICUs was a mere 48 hours. With normal influenza, it's anything up to 5 days. So our medical people have a good chance of getting on top of it if you go to the ICU or get into those critical care. Because my daughter suffered from the 2017 flu outbreak, and basically because they had a bit of lead time into where it starts to develop into septicemia and starts attacking your organs, they've got about 5 days of intervention to sort of help you out. But with swine flu and with COVID, it's a mere 48 hours, and that's what gets the high casualty rates. So there is a slight difference there. But the other thing is just getting onto the states and their different operations that they had. It still goes back to this federal government. The federal government is completely to blame in regards to what the states did. In the first instance, the federal government basically wrote the states a blank check. Do whatever you want. There's no consequences. We're picking up the tab. And that goes from job seeker to job keeper. And I mean, who would have ever thought that doubling the dole would have resulted in people not looking for a job? So, as most of our farmers are finding out. But that initial writing of a blank check by the Commonwealth government for this allowed the state governments to do whatever. If we had a situation where the Commonwealth government didn't completely underwrite and some of the costs were set back on the states, maybe they would have been a bit more pragmatic. But how do you feel about that, Peter, that they may have been more pragmatic if the costs were actually being borne by the state government?
Oh, I'm absolutely sure you're right there. I think there's been a raft of things that have come from Canberra, which have been completely opposite to good sound management practice. Another one which you haven't touched on is, though you're touching on a bit, is the various cures. It seems to be scandalous that Australian medical has banned HCQ, hydroxychloroquine, which is used by many other countries, has been for years and years and years, and if applied early with zinc, mostly stops either bad cases and certainly stops the great majority of deaths. It's been proven in numerous countries, and yet the Australian government has banned it. I talked to my doctor about this, and she said, no, I'd love to prescribe it for you in the event that you had this virus, but I'd be struck off if I did so. And this is just one of many things. And whether or not a North Queensland state could overrule that or not might be a very interesting question.
No, we could always go to the High Court, couldn't we?
Yes. And in fact, there's an interesting point there. I had a chat with one of the legal companies that does the mass cases, and I suggested to them there was ample evidence to demonstrate that if they could find a client or several clients that had a relation that had died of so-called COVID-19 and had not been given HCQ, I would have thought there was a good case for manslaughter or equivalent there.
Yes, I've always wondered about that. Was it just because it was because of Trump trumpeted it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He said he took it, and it was a good thing. Therefore, all the opposition, the Trump derangement syndrome mob, and all the mass media immediately came out against it. 100% political.
That drug's been around for a number of years, treating malaria and other things. So obviously it's safe, but like you said, they did put it on the poisons list to and give it such a category that it couldn't be prescribed, which is somewhat sort of needs to be investigated. But I think at the end of the day, I rather than try to apportion blame in regards to the different responses, I would like to see a Royal Commission after say 6 or months, when this finally does go away, a Royal Commission to have a look of what we did, what worked, and then start setting some benchmarks in regards to what action we'll do for these sort of pandemics in the future. Because in 2017 we had the flu outbreak here. It claimed 1,255 Australian lives. All, children, pregnant women, young people, elderly, fit, the healthy, and the whole lot, right across the board. And then went on to claim 650,000 lives worldwide. Now, we did not do anything in regards to reacting to that outcome. So maybe after this event, maybe there does need to be a sort of Royal Commission to start working out sort of benchmarks when you take certain actions, and especially actions that require this crushing of people's freedoms and rights. I mean, what happened in Victoria? If I had lived in Victoria, I think I would have been arrested every other day because I would have been out on the street, because I just don't believe that they got the right to bloody suppress people who basically are healthy, and as figures show, 80% of the population do not even contract COVID-19 in the first instance. So why the big tar brush tarring everyone the same? I mean, surely there has to be some degree of individual responsibility, yes, and then for those people at high risk, we should make every effort to make sure they're protected, whether we put them into isolation and provide for them in that isolation, and we just get along with our business. And so what? If we catch COVID, it's either, for most people, it's either a non-event or they just get mildly ill. And it's only in those specific demographics of people, elderly with pre-existing conditions, people who are obese and got other medical conditions. But for normal people, it's a non-event, and I think the crushing of people's civil rights was shameful, and really we do need a Royal Commission to make some benchmarks for the future.
Look, I've got a thought on that too. I'd like to add, Bill, is the one thing that we can say that from Central and North Queensland that we might benefit out of the fact that Victoria is a bit of a basket case is the fact that we might experience a population boom of them moving towards our regions. Because I can tell you right now, look, I totally agree. I think there's going to be many a disgruntled person who's a resident of Victoria that's just seen the heavy-handed response in which the government has made, and like you said, even with the results of a commission of some form into it, I think there's going to be a lot of red faces and a lot of embarrassed people when they say, "Geez, I really thought they were doing justice by us. Geez, I really thought that we were going to be safer under the response that they gave." But I think sadly, a place like Victoria is just a great example of why an overbearing and over-governing centralised government is not going to be a good thing. And to be quite honest, I think the last report I saw is $144 billion of debt that they're going to be experiencing in the future to come. As Queensland is experiencing $100 billion of debt, we need to avoid a similar fate as theirs. I must say too, gentlemen, we've just passed an hour as well, so we should bring the show probably to a wrap because we don't want to take too much more time out of Peter's evening, and we really do appreciate you joining us, Peter. Is there any finishing thoughts you'd like to make as we wrap up this evening's show?
The only thought I have is the one biggest bugbear, which I think stands in the way of a new state, really are not having the media aboard. Now, as next general manager of a large broadsheet, I'm totally and utterly appalled about the lack of professionalism within mainstream media now. But having said that, there are ways of getting the message across. I know you, Bill, in particular, have managed to get the message across very well. I'm wondering whether there is scope for doing more. And I notice Max Tomlinson is one of the group, and interviews there on at the moment. I imagine he should be able to assist in terms of how to get the message.
Potential, but one of the biggest problems is because really News Corp is the main newspaper system through at least coastal Queensland and the major regional cities. There's only a few Fairfax outfits, but again, it boils down to the centralisation of the business and their business model. The editorial staff do, from what speaking was, when we first started, we had Julian Thomason was the sub-editor of the Post, and his brother Damien was the editor of the Townsville Bulletin, and we got a fairly good run out of them at the time, as far as getting stories in. But we could not sort of even convince them to actually go to the editorial stage because, yes, it's okay getting stories in the newspaper when you manage to do something or whatever, or in response to some action that's occurred. But what you really do need is the editorial support and regularly. If you could just go back to the case in New South Wales when the New England movement was working in the 50s towards their separate state, and they actually got through to the referendum stage in 67. But in the early stages, the separation movement actually goes back to, obviously pre-colonial times, and then it reinvented in the 20s and that. But there was a guy called Victor Thompson, and I think he might have been in Tamworth or Armidale. He might have been in the Armidale Times. And he organised 130 different newspapers as a coalition, because in those days they were all small independents, but he organised 130 independent small newspapers in regional New South Wales to support the new state movement. Now, if we had even just but minimum support from News Corp papers, we'd probably be a lot better off. But yes, we do need the media to be on side, but again, we are sort of caught up in a situation where it's a centralised industry. It's got its own sort of agenda, and then even the different editors in each newspaper. Not that there's many left, because the only printed newspapers left in central North Queensland basically is the Post and the Townsville Bulletin. The Gladstone Observer, Bundaberg, Mackay and Rockhampton newspapers have gone out of print. I mean, they're online, but they've basically got next to no staff in those parts. But it sometimes just depends a little bit on the makeup of the editor, and sometimes they support the concept and other times they don't support it at all. I don't think the Jennifer Dillsbury in Cairns Post actually support. Craig Warhurst in Townsville was a little bit better. It gives us a bit more freedom, but yeah, until they're actually on side with doing editorials and that, we've got a long way to go with those people.
I'm sure you're right, David. You have my sympathies, and I think Jennifer Spilsbury has given up answering my emails now. But I think it may be that the realities, as opposed to myths, of the COVID-19 could just provide a focus. Anyway, look,
Yes,
very best of luck, and I'll just say thank you very, very much for inviting me. I've enjoyed talking with you a lot. You certainly stimulated my brain for a lot of things that haven't been stimulated for a while, and I appreciate it, and I certainly wish you all the very best of luck.
Yes, it's a pleasure.
And
I'll
gladly talk to you again.
Thank you.
I'll gladly, Peter, I'll gladly talk to you on some other occasion and try to get that New Zealand model out of your system, and just get in touch with the Australian Constitution, the way we move forward there.
I'll rewrite it.
Good on you.
Okay,
Thank you, Peter.
thanks very much.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening wherever you are in central and north Queensland, my name's David Young with the Boot Brisbane campaign up here in Cairns. Thank you for tuning in and listening. Look, tune in next week where we might have another interesting guest, just like we did Peter Senior this evening. If you'd like to learn more about the campaign to create a new state in central and north Queensland, you can visit our webpage, which is just bootbrisbane.com. There you can find flyers and all sorts of information regarding historical context, the Constitution, and how we have a pathway forward to creating a new state in central and north Queensland. Likewise, you can visit our Facebook page, which is just bootbrisbane.com, where there's an active community involved in talking about and how the communities of central and north Queensland could be far better governed and have better sovereignty should we have a new state. I would like to thank the sponsor of this evening's show, which is Yes to a North Queensland State. Now, they're a sister Facebook page which has a community based around the same premise of discussions about North Queensland politics, northern and central Queensland politics, and how we could do so much better if we would just take the reins ourselves. You could listen in on Mondays to another amazing podcast with Matt Maloney from Northern Vibe, and he has some interesting guests on himself and discusses all things central and north Queensland, and even has local artists and all sorts of interesting types on there too. So with that, thank you again, Peter, for joining us this evening. Thank you for taking time out of your evening, and good evening, gentlemen.
Good night, David. Good night, Peter.
Good night, David.
Good night, gentlemen.